You ever wonder how slavery gets talked about like it was just mean overseers and hard work, instead of the hell that it actually was? Yeah, you can thank America's favorite pastime: editing black pain to make white people sleep better at night. Let's talk about the Federal Writers Project's slave narratives. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the U.S. government decided that it was time to preserve history. So they sent writers under the Federal Writers Project to interview formerly enslaved black people. Sounds good, right? Except for one small problem. Most of the interviewers were white. Many were the children or grandchildren of slave owners. And some of them were full-blown racists with clipboards. Go figure. Now imagine surviving slavery. Imagine the beatings, the grapes, the family separations, the chains, and sitting across from some smiling white stranger asking you to tell your story. What exactly do you think you're going to say? Especially when you know that telling the raw truth could get you or your family attacked, harassed, or worse. So what happened? A lot of formerly enslaved people softened their stories. Some minimized the brutality. Some called enslavers good or kind masters. Because survival teaches you how to talk when danger still lives next door. And the interviewers, they leaned into it, of course. They asked safe questions. They deleted the ugly parts. They cleaned it up. And the result? A big shiny archive that too often reads like slavery was a sad, complicated misunderstanding, instead of what it really was: genocide, terror, legalized torture. And even today, people pull these watered-down narratives to argue. They say, see, slavery wasn't that bad. Some slaves liked their masters. Please. Yeah, because they had a gun pointed at their futures while they told the story. The Federal Writers Project didn't record history. It rewrote it at the source. America didn't want to hear the truth about slavery. It wanted a bedtime story, with black suffering neatly tucked in at the end. So we're not going to romanticize the past. We have to remember. Even our pain had to pass through white hands before it was allowed to exist on paper. John Brown walked into a federal armory with 21 men and a plan to start a war against slavery. He wasn't confused. He wasn't unstable. He was ready. And they hanged him for doing what the government refused to do: fight for black freedom. It was 1859 and John Brown led a raid on Harper's Ferry. His goal? Take the weapons, arm the enslaved black people, and ignite a rebellion across the South. Not a riot, not a protest. A war. He'd spent years preparing. This wasn't some last-minute act of rage. He raised money, built relationships with black communities. He listened. He planned. He studied revolutions. And then he moved. He and 21 others, including 5 black men, they stormed the armory. They held it for hours. But word spread. The military showed up. Some of Brown's sons were unalived. Others were captured. He was arrested, beaten, and put on trial. They offered him a chance to say it was a mistake, but he didn't take it. Instead, he said, "I'm not guilty, but I do acknowledge having done what I did. And if it's necessary that I die to end this blood-soaked system, then so be it." They hanged him on December 2nd, 1859, and he never apologized. He believed slavery was a crime that couldn't be voted away, that justice couldn't come from inside a system that created the violence in the first place. And I don't disagree. And apparently they didn't either, because 16 months later, the Civil War began. John Brown wasn't a martyr. He was a fighter. He saw a system built on chains, and he broke that silence with action. He didn't wait for the right election cycle. He didn't ask if people were ready. He made his choice and accepted the cost. And if you've never heard his full story, it's because they don't want you to know that somebody did what actually needed to be done. And they sure as hell don't want you asking yourself what you would have done if you were alive then. Or worse, what are you doing now?
Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, Africans. I hope you're faring well where you are, and if you ain't faring well, please fare well where you are. You see, when I was a kid, my teacher used to sing me a particular nursery rhyme. John Brown shoes are polished so shine. In the town there is a butcher, and his name is Samson John Brown. Yes, Samson John Brown. You see, in every injustice that happens, there arises one individual who refuses to bow to that specific injustice. Right now in my country, Kenya, we have a lot of injustice, and we have specific people standing up against the injustice. You see, if you see an injustice happening and you turn your back unto it, you are the same as the perpetrator who is causing the injustice. These are the words of a clergyman who goes by the name Desmond Tutu, a man who fought along Nelson Mandela to bring an end to apartheid in South Africa, right? So it's good that you understand in every injustice, there is always someone who rises to fight against it, right? And today, this specific individual that I want us to talk about is a man by the name John Brown. You see, in 19th century America, that is, there was a man who sparked the whole country, you see. His name was John Brown, a white man whose Russia's fury against slavery blazed hotter than the chains he sought to break. Though armed with Bible verses in one hand and a rifle on the other, John Wall was waging a war of morality, conviction, and blood. He was not the path of diplomacy or delay. It was the path of divine reckoning. Through his life, John Brown was forced the USA to confront its original sin. What's the USA original sin? You may comment in the comment section. What is it? It is slavery. So he forced the US to remember its original sin, which was slavery. This man is a man who was fighting a battle of morality, a battle of conviction, and a battle of blood. He was fighting for the black people, even though he was white. That is John Brown. Some people love him, some people do not. He is a man who is very polarizing. Some extremely like him, some extremely dislike him. I think by now, you may know who likes him and the ones who do not like him. But I want us to dive into a video where people are trying to explain who John Brown was, right? His contributions to the end of slavery, and why it is important that we also learn about John Brown. Yes, let's dive into these videos. I shall share with you my thoughts by the end of the video, where we shall also have a deep, critical analysis. Let's dive in.
During his lifetime, John Brown was one of the most controversial and divisive figures in American history. Some people saw him as a freedom fighter, others saw him as a terrorist. Some compared him to Jesus, others thought he was Satan. So who was John Brown, and why did he inspire such intense emotions? And perhaps most importantly, does the legend of John Brown have anything to teach us today? John Brown was born in 1800 in Connecticut, and his life was greatly shaped by his father, Owen. Owen Brown was a dedicated abolitionist who believed that slavery was evil and had to be abolished. He put his ideas into action by helping Black Americans escape slavery on the Underground Railroad. Owen taught all of his children to live by the Christian golden rule, that you should treat others how you wanted them to treat you. Therefore, he forbid any of his family members to discriminate against people of color. The Brown family stood out during this time period for treating everyone equally, including Black and Native Americans. As an adult, John Brown adopted his father's abolitionist views and came to see slavery as the greatest evil on earth. But John Brown took these views even further. He came to see himself as God's instrument to destroy slavery once and for all. After a pro-slavery mob murdered the abolitionist newspaper editor Elijah P. Lovejoy in Illinois in 1837, John Brown made a public oath at a prayer meeting. He stood up and said, "Here before God in the presence of these witnesses, from this time, I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery." Like his father, John Brown became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and when he bought a farmhouse in New York in 1849, he used his property to hide escaped slaves and help them on their journey to freedom. He also used this land to create a utopian community where blacks and whites could live side by side in peace and harmony. Brown shocked many people by his insistence on living and working next to Black Americans and embodying a truly equal and non-racist society. His son, John Brown Jr., said, "Father's favorite theme was that of the community of cooperative industry, in which all should labor for the common good, having all things in common, as did the disciples of Jesus in his day. This has been and still is my communistic and socialist faith." In the 1850s, John Brown was drawn to Kansas, where the fight over slavery was boiling over into open warfare. As more Americans continued to pour into the Kansas territory and steal land from indigenous people, a conflict arose whether Kansas would become a free state or a slave state once it joined the Union. Pro-slavery advocates rushed over the border from Missouri to fight for slavery, and they did so through terror and voter fraud by illegally voting for pro-slavery candidates in Kansas elections. At the same time, Northern abolitionists came to Kansas to fight for a free state and free soil. The battle between these two forces became so deadly that this time period is known as Bleeding Kansas. For years, pro-slavery vigilantes terrorized, tortured, and murdered abolitionists in Kansas, and in 1856, two events drove John Brown to fight back. On May 21st, a pro-slavery mob attacked the anti-slavery town of Lawrence, and on the following day, the battle over slavery erupted in Washington, D.C. After the abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner delivered a speech in the Senate condemning slavery, the pro-slavery Senator Preston Brooks viciously beat him with his cane, almost taking his life. After these outrages, John Brown decided to meet violence with violence. In one of the most controversial acts of his life, John Brown led a group of men, including his sons, on a nighttime mission to murder 5 pro-slavery supporters in Kansas. In what became known as the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, Brown ordered the abduction and murder of 5 men who were hacked to death with swords. After these murders, many saw Brown as nothing more than a cold-blooded killer. But historians like David S. Reynolds would argue that we have to see these murders in the context of Bleeding Kansas, and realize that Brown was responding to much greater violence on the pro-slavery side. A few months after these murders, John Brown became famous during the Battle of Blackjack and the Battle of Osawatomie. In both cases, Brown and his followers fought back against pro-slavery forces. Even if neither was a stunning military victory, Brown was able to use guerrilla warfare techniques to inflict damages on his enemies and escape with his life. And with each battle he survived, the legend of John Brown grew. For many in the pro-slavery South, he became a symbol of terror. For some in the abolitionist North, he became a source of hope and inspiration. Now that Brown was a folk hero and celebrity, he began to attract moral and financial support from some of America's most recognizable figures. Brown met with both Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, who supported his efforts to fight slavery. Brown also gained admirers among the Transcendentalist movement, including Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. But perhaps his greatest achievement was securing the financial support of a group of men known as the Secret Six. These were the men who provided him with the money he needed to plan his next big action, the raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. Brown believed he had a solid plan to defeat slavery once and for all. He would attack the arsenal at Harper's Ferry and use the weapons to arm freed slaves. They would go on to liberate enslaved people on southern plantations to wage a war against the slave owners until slavery was ended. Brown's plan was inspired by slave revolts, such as the one led by Nat Turner in Virginia in 1831. Brown even chose to arm the freed slaves with pikes in imitation of Turner. In October 1859, Brown launched his attack on Harper's Ferry, and at first it was a great success. With only a handful of men, he was able to seize the arsenal and take several hostages. However, they were soon outnumbered and surrounded by U.S. soldiers led by Robert E. Lee. After a shootout, several of Brown's men were left dead, including his son, and Brown himself was captured and taken to prison. During his trial, Brown bravely defended his anti-slavery ideals and argued that by fighting slavery, he was doing God's work. However, he was found guilty of treason, and on December 2nd, 1859, he was executed by hanging. But the spirit of John Brown did not die. His spirit helped to fuel the abolitionist movement and inspire the Union soldiers who fought against the Confederacy in the Civil War. In fact, the most popular marching song that Union soldiers sang during the war was titled John Brown's Body, with the powerful chorus, "John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on." After his death, some saw Brown as a terrorist who deserved to die. Others saw him as a freedom fighter and a martyr who gave his life for the greatest cause on earth, fighting for the enslaved and the oppressed. And today, there is still controversy over the legacy of John Brown. Some people think he should always be condemned for using violence to achieve his goals. Others believe that he did what he had to do to fight against the inhumanity of slavery. However, what no one can deny is that John Brown dedicated his life to fighting for a country where everyone was free and equal, and he was willing to die for that world. If that is not something to be inspired by and honor, then I don't know what is. If you want to learn more about the amazing life of John Brown, check out the book John Brown, Abolitionist by David S. Reynolds. And make sure to watch the series The Good Lord Bird. Ethan Hawke gives an unforgettable performance of an American icon that should always be remembered. Because the soul of John Brown still goes. What was the primary cause of the American Civil War? Seems like a simple question, right? But when you're dealing with how Americans remember their past, nothing is simple, because there's probably no other country on earth that lies to itself more about its history than the United States. I agree with Michael Harriot, who argues that the American history most of us are taught in school is a myth, a fiction, a fantasy, a fable, and a lie. And nowhere are these lies more evident than how this country deals with the history of the Civil War. Even though every single legitimate scholar will tell you that slavery was the primary cause of the Civil War, a majority of Americans disagree. The last time the Pew Research Center conducted a poll on American views of the Civil War, they received shocking results. They found that a majority of Americans believe the Civil War was not about slavery, but about states' rights. A more recent poll from 2019 found that 41% of Americans still believe that slavery was not the cause of the Civil War. For over 150 years, many have tried to distort the real cause of the Civil War by focusing on the empty phrase, states' rights. But to get to the truth, all you have to do is ask, the states' right to do what? The answer is clear. The Civil War was started by Southern states fighting for the right to own slaves. The evidence for this conclusion comes from the historical primary sources of that time period. All we have to do is look at the declarations of the states that broke away from the Union and see the reasons that they listed for forming the Confederacy. For example, the first state to break away from the Union in 1860 was South Carolina. Slavery was critical to South Carolina, which had earned the title of the slave capital of the New World in the 1700s, because during the slave trade, over 40% of all enslaved African Americans passed through this territory. Now let's turn to their declaration of the immediate causes which induce and justify the secession of South Carolina from the federal Union, which argued that the primary cause for leaving the Union in 1860 was an increasing hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states to the institution of slavery. When Mississippi left the Union in 1861, they issued a similar declaration, which stated, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of the commerce of the earth. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization." If we analyze the secession declarations of South Carolina, Mississippi, Georgia, and Texas, we find that the word slavery is used over 80 times. The word right is used over 30 times, but only in the context of the right to own slaves. However, the phrase states' rights is not mentioned a single time. These documents prove beyond a doubt that slavery was the primary cause of the Civil War. And so do the speeches and writings of Southerners during that time period. For example, in 1863, the journalist and Confederate supporter William Thompson explained that, as a people, we are fighting to maintain the heaven-ordained supremacy of the white man over the inferior or colored race. However, perhaps one of the greatest pieces of evidence we have on this matter is the cornerstone speech by Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens. Stephens was absolutely clear that slavery was the reason why the Confederacy was formed and why the Civil War was started. In 1861, he said, "The new Confederate Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution of African slavery as it exists among us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization." This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. Jefferson Davis, in his forecast, had anticipated this as the rock upon which the old Union would split. He was right. What was conjecture with him is now a realized fact. If anyone ever tries to tell you that states' rights and not slavery was the cause of the Civil War, I want you to read them this portion of Alexander Stephens' infamous cornerstone speech. In 1861, he explained, "The cornerstone of the Confederate government rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world, based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. The northern states were attempting to make things equal, which the Creator had made unequal." Racists like Alexander Stephens were willing to destroy the United States and even die for their right to own slaves. They believed that owning black people was essential for their way of life. In fact, in 1859, Stephens even argued that the U.S. needed to renew the international slave trade, which had been abolished in 1808. He said that the South must get more Africans and that Negro slavery is but in its infancy. Others, like Virginia politician Edmund Ruffin, had been calling for the South to break away from the Union and form their own slave nation decades before the Civil War broke out. In fact, Ruffin loved slavery so much he hoped that one day white people would take over the entire African continent and enslave all of its people. So it's clear that the primary reason why 11 states left the Union and sparked the Civil War is to fight for their right to own black people and live in a white supremacist world. That's why Michael Harriot doesn't even call it the Civil War. He calls it the War for White Supremacy, the War of Slaveholder Aggression, the War for Unending Enslavement. What's so disturbing is that ever since the Civil War ended in 1865, there has been a major effort to rewrite history and make it seem like slavery wasn't a factor in the war at all. Studies have shown that textbooks used in Southern classrooms frequently downplay the importance of slavery in the war and instead focus on the myth of states' rights. Virginia, which is where the capital of the Confederacy was located, has a long history of distorting the causes of the Civil War. In 1997, Virginia Governor George Allen issued a proclamation written by the sons of Confederate veterans that claimed the Civil War was fought over independence and sovereign rights, but not slavery. In 2010, Virginia Governor and convicted felon Bob McDonnell designated April as Confederate History Month. However, in his proclamation, he didn't mention the word slavery once, even though the only reason the Confederacy existed at all is to defend slavery. Over the past few years, we've seen politicians and public officials repeatedly promote lies and distortions about the Civil War. In 2017, Trump's Chief of Staff John Kelly made the ridiculous argument that the lack of the ability to compromise led to the Civil War. But how do you compromise with slavery? How do you compromise with people who saw black Americans as property and not human beings? In the same year, Trump tried to erase history by arguing that nobody really knows why the Civil War started. He said, "People don't ask that question, but why was there a Civil War? Why could that one not have been worked out?" Trump then went on to make the absurd claim that had Andrew Jackson been a little bit later, you wouldn't have had the Civil War. He was a very tough person, but he had a big heart, and he was really angry that he saw what was happening with regard to the Civil War. He said, "There's no reason for this." This comment is absolutely ridiculous for many reasons, but mostly because Andrew Jackson was a white supremacist and a slave owner. Now that the Trump administration is ramping up their attacks on American history, there is no doubt that they will continue to promote the lie that slavery had nothing to do with the Civil War. And this has always been the goal of many people in this country, especially groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy. They want you to forget that this nation was founded on slavery and the brutal exploitation of black people, and that a war was fought to keep this evil institution alive. That's why if you look around the country, you'll still find hundreds of statues honoring Confederate soldiers. But you have to look hard to find the few statues celebrating the end of slavery and black resistance. And that's why the American people have to fight to keep the truth about our history alive. We know why the Civil War was fought, and we know that if we can't find a way to unite the country and fight for the rights of all of its people, then a new civil war could be right around the corner.
Yes. Now, after clearly watching these videos, here is my deep critical analysis. John Brown was born on May 9th, 1800, exactly 1800, in Torrington, in a state called Connecticut, into a deeply devout Calvinist family. His father, Owen Brown, was a fervent opponent of slavery, and his moral fire was instilled into young John. The family later moved to Ohio, a state that bordered the slave South, where Brown witnessed firsthand the cruelty visited upon enslaved people. One of the most defining moments of his youth was seeing a black boy his own age beaten with an iron shovel. That image never left John Brown. Unlike many contemporaries who viewed slavery as a regrettable economic practice or a political issue to be managed, John Brown saw it as an affront to God. He believed, quite literally, that slavery was a sin that could damn a nation. His anti-slavery stance wasn't merely emotional, it was theological. Brown saw himself not as a mere man, but an instrument of divine justice, chosen to bring judgment upon the wicked system of the human bondage in the United States of America. So he was a different kind of an abolitionist. Remember, this man was having a Bible in one hand, on the other hand, he was having a rifle, right? He fought for morality, conviction, and blood. You see, in a world where most white abolitionists were content to argue, debate, and petition Congress, John Brown chose a different route. He chose action. While intellectuals like William Lloyd Garrison believed in moral suasion, and politicians like Abraham Lincoln sought gradual containment, Brown believed slavery could only be destroyed through armed struggle. I told you we have people who will take it upon themselves to bring an end to an oppression, even if it means them losing their own life. You see, John was not alone in this thought. Many black abolitionists agreed with him. We have Frederick Douglass, a very, very nice person. I do like this man, Frederick Douglass. I really liked him. I like him still. Though later critical of Brown's method, Frederick Douglass once said, John Brown began the war that ended American slavery and made this a free republic. Unlike many of his fellow white abolitionists, Brown treated black people as equals, not as victims, not as projects for salvation, but as comrades in arms. You see, Brown's ideological battle turned physical in 1855, when he and 5 of his sons moved to Kansas during the violent struggle over whether the territory would enter the Union as a slave or free state. There, pro-slavery forces terrorized anti-slavery settlers with murder, arson, and the grape. Brown responded with most infamous early act, the Patonowime massacre in retaliation for pro-slavery violence. Brown led a small group that brutally executed 5 pro-slavery settlers. The act shocked the nation. You see? Critics called him a terrorist. Supporters called him a warrior for justice. Brown made no apologies. He believed he was doing God's work, and that violence against violent institutions was not only justified, it was righteous. You see? So we have a certain incident that is called the Hampers Ferry, the spark that lit the fuse. You see? John Brown's most audacious plan came in 1859, when he launched a raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, with only 21 men. You see, John Brown, himself included, several free black men and fugitive slaves. Brown aimed to seize weapons, spark a massive slave uprising, and march through the South, freeing the enslaved and building a black stronghold in the Appalachian Mountains. The raid, even though failed, Brown was captured by the U.S. Marines under Robert E. Lee. 10 of his men were killed, and the slave uprising he hoped for never materialized. But Brown's mission did not die in the armory. At his trial, he turned the courtroom into a pulpit, declaring, "It is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the end of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this country. I say, let it be done." You see, this man was a martyr. On 2nd December 1859, John Brown was hanged for treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia. Yet in death, he became more powerful than he was ever in life. Northern abolitionists, previously hesitant about violent action, began to embrace John as a martyr. The transcendentalists, of course, it's a hard word, transcendentalists. You see, we had a man by the name Henry David Thoreau, who gave a new famous speech, a plea for Captain John Brown, likening him to a modern-day Christ. Southerners, on the other hand, were terrified. If white men like John Brown were willing to kill and die for the freedom of black people, what might come next? I understand their worry. Southern militias mobilized. Fear and paranoia swept the South. Historians largely agree John Brown's raid made the Civil War inevitable. You see, John Brown was not perfect. He could be impulsive, messianic, and morally rigid. But he was also courageous beyond comprehension. He believed in the full humanity of black people at a time when most of America did not. He did not wait for society to catch up to morality. He forced it to them. In doing so, he became a rare historical figure, a white man who risked everything, not for his own gain, but for the liberation of other races. He wasn't merely a friend to the Negro, as some labeled him. He was a revolutionary who saw the future through the lens of justice, not legality. You see? John Brown's life was a litmus in the powder keg of American history. He exposed the moral bankruptcy of a nation that could preach liberty while chaining millions. He showed that sometimes the only language tyrants understand is force. His actions split the Union, inspired generations of freedom fighters, and remain a haunting reminder of what one person can do when driven by unshakable sense of justice. As the Union Army marched through southern fields in the Civil War that followed, they sang, John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. And indeed, It did. You see, even though people might say that some white people are racist, some white people are this and that, they don't like blacks, but people are built differently. You see, it is God who knows the heart of man. The heart of man is full of envy, is full of anger, is full of resentment, is full of jealousy, is full of lust, it's full of bad things. I can laugh with you right now, but I have a knife behind me as a black person, and I'm laughing to you as a black person. Also, a white person can be laughing at you. They don't only laugh with their teeth, they laugh with their heart as well. John Brown was both laughing with his heart and laughing with his teeth. He was angry with his eyes and he was angry with his heart. This is a man, even though many of his followers did not agree with his methods, he was legit. We don't have so many legit people in this world. Loyalty is not a thing that people really take as a virtue. No. I personally have come to realize that John Brown's history is one thing which is very, very important to me myself. I like his story. John Brown, a man who went against his own to protect what his own was oppressing. What a legend. What a legend. We have a few of them. Some of them are going extinct. Yeah? Yes. So I hope that you've gained some value from this, and if you've gained some value, subscribe. I'll surely appreciate. And remember to support me on Patreon. If God allows you, support me on Patreon. I'll surely appreciate. And see you in the next one. Oh, remember this. When somebody puts it upon themselves that God has sent them to do a duty, they will go to any extent.